To stand at the intersection of Kaishiku in Beijing today, one sees the bustle of a modern metropolis. Cars honk, pedestrians rush to work, and the glass towers of finance gleam under the sun. But beneath the asphalt, the ground holds the memory of blood. For centuries, this was the stage for the most terrifying theater of the human experience. It was here, and in public squares across the vast expanse of imperial China, that the state enacted a ritual known as Lingchi. To the Western world, it became the death by 1,000 cuts, a phrase that has since entered the lexicon as a metaphor for a slow, agonizing defeat. But for the people who lived under the shadow of the dragon throne, it was no metaphor. It was a tangible, visceral reality. It was the ultimate sanction, the final boundary between the emperor's order and the chaos of rebellion. To understand it, we cannot simply look at the knives or the wounds. We must peel back the layers of history, theology, and law to understand why a civilization famous for its poetry, its bureaucracy, and its Confucian ethics would design a punishment of such singular brutality. The story of Lingchi does not begin with violence. It begins with love. Specifically, the love and duty a child owes to their parents. In the grand tapestry of Chinese philosophy, the individual does not exist in a vacuum. You are a link in an eternal chain. Your body is not your own property to do with as you please. It is a sacred inheritance, a vessel of flesh and bone gifted to you by your father and mother, who received it from their parents, stretching back to the dawn of time. The great sage Confucius, whose teachings formed the bedrock of Chinese society for 2,000 years, was explicit on this matter. He taught that filial piety, or shao, was the root of all virtue. To preserve the body whole, from the hair on one's head to the tips of one's toes, was the first duty of a righteous son or daughter. To die with one's body intact was a blessing. It meant that when the spirit left the mortal coil, it would be recognized by the ancestors in the afterlife. It meant the cycle would continue. Therefore, the ultimate punishment could not merely be the ending of a life. Death comes to us all eventually. It is the great equalizer. For the crimes that shook the foundations of the universe, high treason against the emperor, the murder of one's master, or the unthinkable crime of patricide, death was insufficient. The punishment had to reach beyond the grave. It had to destroy the integrity of the body to ensure the destruction of the soul. This is the theological terror of Lingchi. It was a method of execution designed to sever the link between the living and the dead. If the body was cut into pieces, if the limbs were separated from the torso and the head severed from the neck, the spirit would be fragmented. It would become a hungry ghost, a wandering, shapeless entity in the netherworld, unable to accept the offerings of incense and food from its descendants. It would be exiled from the family line, erased from history, and doomed to eternal suffering. Thus, when a judge slammed his wooden block on the table and sentenced a man to Lingchi, he was not just sentencing him to pain in this world, he was sentencing him to oblivion in the next. The origins of this practice are shrouded in the mists of the turbulent 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, a time of chaos and civil war in the 10th century. Before this era, the Chinese penal code was governed by the 5 punishments, which included tattooing the face, cutting off the nose, amputation of the feet, castration, and death by strangulation or decapitation. Strangulation was actually considered a merciful death because the body remained whole. Decapitation was worse, but still quick. However, as warlords fought for control and emperors sought to instill absolute fear in their subjects, they began to experiment. The earliest records suggest that Lingchi was codified under the Liao dynasty, a regime established by the Khitan people. Initially, it was a savage, unregulated act of vengeance against rebels. But as the Liao were absorbed into the broader Chinese legal tradition, and as the Song dynasty rose, the punishment began to take on a bureaucratic form. It ceased to be a random act of war and became a defined article of the law. By the time of the Yuan dynasty, under the Mongol rulers, and subsequently the Ming dynasty, Lingchi had cemented its place at the apex of the legal system. It is important to understand that this was not a common punishment. The vast majority of executions in China were simple beheadings. Lingchi was reserved for the 3 abominations. First among them was plotting to overthrow the emperor. The emperor was not just a king, he was the son of heaven. the pivot around which the cosmos turned. To strike at him was to strike at the sun itself. Second was high treason, which included defecting to an enemy state or destroying imperial tombs. Third was the crime against the family, killing a parent or a grandparent. This hierarchy of crime reveals the values of the state. Loyalty to the ruler and loyalty to the father were the two poles of existence. Let us transport ourselves to the height of the Ming dynasty to witness how the machinery of this justice operated. The legal system of imperial China was a marvel of complexity. It was not a lawless land, it was a land of too many laws. Every crime had a specific punishment, and every punishment had to be verified by multiple layers of bureaucracy. A sentence of Lingchi could not be carried out by a local magistrate on a whim. It required a confession, often extracted through torture, and then the paperwork had to travel all the way to the capital, to the Board of Punishments, and often to the emperor himself for the vermilion brush mark, the red ink signature that confirmed the death warrant. This bureaucratic delay meant that a prisoner might languish in the dungeons for months, or even years, knowing exactly what fate awaited them. The psychological torture of this waiting period cannot be overstated. The prisons of the era were hellish places, damp, rat-infested cells where disease ran rampant. But for the condemned marked for Lingchi, there was a special kind of dread. They would have heard the stories. In the marketplaces and tea houses, the common people loved to share exaggerated tales of executions. They whispered of criminals who were sliced 3,000 times, of executioners who could remove a sliver of flesh the size of a coin without spilling a drop of blood. They spoke of the fish, scale cuts, and the stripping of the robe. These legends, while often exaggerated, fed the terror of the prisoner. The prisoner knew that on the day of their death, they would not merely be killed, they would be turned into a spectacle. They would be unmade in front of thousands of jeering eyes. As the day of execution approached, the preparation began. The role of the executioner is a subject of grim fascination. In the West, executioners were often hooded, anonymous figures. In China, they were known faces in the community, though often shunned. The job was frequently hereditary, a burden passed from father to son. A master executioner in the Ming or Qing dynasty was a skilled anatomist. He had to be. To follow the letter of the law, he had to know exactly where the arteries lay, where the tendons connected the muscle to the bone, and how to inflict maximum damage without causing premature death. If the prisoner died too quickly, before the requisite number of cuts were delivered, the executioner himself could be punished for incompetence. Therefore, they practiced. They practiced on melons, slicing the skin so thinly that the fruit inside remained unbruised. They practiced on meat sold in the markets. They developed a steady hand and a cold detachment. The tools of the trade were specific. This was not the work of a heavy axe. The executioner's kit, often wrapped in red silk, contained a variety of knives. There was the castration knife, a small, curved blade. There was the slicing knife, razor-sharp and thin, used for the flesh of the arms and legs. There was the heart-digging knife, a sturdier, pointed dagger meant for the final coup de grace. And there was the head cutter, a heavier blade for the final severance. These tools were kept immaculately clean, sharpened on whetstones until they could split a hair. They were the instruments of the emperor's will, treating the human body as a canvas for the law. When the death warrant finally arrived from the capital, usually carried by a rider on a fast horse, the process moved swiftly. The execution was typically scheduled for the autumn assizes. In traditional Chinese thought, executions were rarely carried out in the spring or summer, which were seasons of growth and life. Death belonged to the autumn and winter, the seasons of decay and harvest. The logic was cosmic. To kill during the growing season would offend the heavens and cause droughts or floods. So, as the leaves turned brown and the cold winds blew from the north, the prisons would empty. On the morning of the execution, the prisoner was brought out of the cell. They were often given a final meal, a severed head meal, usually consisting of rice, meat, and wine. This was the last act of mercy. In many cases, if the prisoner's family had wealth, this was the moment when the bribery occurred. The family would approach the executioner or the prison guards with taels of silver. They were not buying life. That was impossible. They were buying a faster death. They would pay the executioner to sharpen his blade to its finest point, or to ensure that the heart stab happened earlier in the process. Most importantly, they would pay for opium. A heavy dose of opium could dull the senses, turning the screaming agony into a hazy nightmare. But for the poor, or for the hated traitors who had no family left to bribe the guards, there was no opium. There was only the raw, unadulterated reality of the knife. The procession to the execution ground was a public event. In Beijing, the cart would rumble out of the distinct gate of the city wall, heading toward Keishiku. The prisoner was usually placed in a wooden cage cart, or simply bound in an open wagon. A placard was attached to their back, stating their name and their crime, with a red X crossed over the characters. As the cart moved through the streets, the reaction of the populace was complex. We must avoid the mistake of thinking the crowd was merely bloodthirsty savages. They were people living in a harsh world, where the emperor's law was the only thing standing between order and anarchy. To them, the traitor in the cart was a monster who had threatened their stability. They threw rotten vegetables, they cursed, they spat. But there were also those who watched in silence, seeing in the prisoner's face the fragility of their own lives. The noise of the procession was deafening. The banging of gongs to clear the way, the shouting of the guards, the murmur of thousands of people. It was a sensory overload. The dust of Beijing, yellow and choking, filled the air. The smell of unwashed bodies, of frying food from the street vendors, of horse manure. And through it all, the prisoner rode, their hands bound, their doom approaching with every turn of the wheel. They were leaving the world of the living and entering the world of the story. They were about to become a lesson written in blood. As the cart arrived at Kaishiku, the geography of death became clear. The execution ground was not a specially built stadium. It was a marketplace. The vegetable market mouth. During the morning, farmers sold cabbages and onions here. At noon, the executioner took the stage. This juxtaposition of the mundane and the horrific is central to the Chinese experience of public execution. Death was not hidden away in a sanitized chamber. It was right there, next to the grocery stalls. It was a part of life. The wooden post, stripped of bark, stood in the center of the clearing. The ground around it was often dark, stained from previous executions, the earth having drunk its fill of history. The prisoner was dragged from the cart. Stripped to the waist, their frailty was exposed to the biting wind. The guards, efficient and practiced, lashed the prisoner to the post. Ropes were tightened around the ankles, the knees, the waist, the chest, and the arms. The head was pulled back by the queue, the long braid of hair worn by men in the Qing dynasty, and tied to the top of the post, exposing the throat. The crowd pressed against the barriers. Silence would begin to fall, a heavy, expectant silence. The magistrate, seated at a raised table nearby, would check the time. It had to be noon. The hour of the horse. This was the time when yang energy, the energy of the sun and life, was at its zenith. The ancients believed that executing a criminal at high noon would suppress the yin energy, the energy of death and ghosts, preventing the vengeful spirit from haunting the living. The sun stood high. The shadow of the post was short. The executioner stepped forward, his knives glinting. He looked at the magistrate. The magistrate threw down the token. The token hits the ground. Dust rises. The sound is a dull thud, but to the prisoner bound against the wood, it sounds like the cracking of the world. The executioner moves with a speed that belies the gravity of the moment. He does not hesitate. Hesitation is for the amateur. This is the work of the state. The first act of Lingchi is perhaps the most shocking to the uninitiated eye. In the popular imagination, one might expect the torture to begin with the fingers or the toes, a slow creeping pain moving inward. But the standard protocol of the Qing dynasty was far more visceral. It began at the chest. The executioner steps in close, invading the prisoner's personal space. With his left hand, he grabs the flesh of the right pectoral muscle, pulling it taut away from the ribcage. With his right hand, the blade flashes, a short, swift motion. It is not a sawing motion. It is a single, clean slice. The muscle is severed. The flap of flesh is cast aside, sometimes thrown into a wicker basket at the foot of the post, sometimes simply allowed to fall to the blood-stained earth. The reaction of the body is immediate. Blood does not spray in a cinematic fountain. Rather, it wells up, dark and heavy, coating the white bone of the rib cage that is now suddenly, impossibly visible. The prisoner, if not heavily sedated by opium, usually lets out a sound that is not quite a scream. It is a gasp, a primal expulsion of air as the brain struggles to comprehend that the body has been opened. This initial cut is known in the trade as opening the door. It is symbolic. It exposes the heart, the seat of the soul, and the mind in Chinese medicine, to the scrutiny of the heavens. It says to the crowd, "Here is the traitor. See that he is mortal. See that he is meat." Immediately, the executioner repeats the motion on the left side. The symmetry is crucial. Lingchi is a ritual of balance. Left and right, yin and yang. Now the prisoner's chest is a ruin, the lungs visible behind the cage of ribs, rising and falling in panic. The crowd leans in. This is the moment where the reality of the punishment sets in. The voyeurism of the spectator is a complex psychological phenomenon. They are not merely watching a man die. They are watching the taboo of the interior becoming the exterior. To see the inside of a human being is forbidden knowledge, usually reserved for doctors or butchers. To see it in the bright light of noon is a transgression that holds the audience in a trance. The executioner then moves to the limbs. This is where the skill of the red craftsman is truly tested. If he cuts too deep, he might sever the brachial artery in the arm, or the femoral artery in the leg. If that happens, the blood pressure drops rapidly. The prisoner goes into hypovolemic shock, and death follows within minutes. That is a failure. The sentence requires the prisoner to witness their own dismantling. So, the cuts on the arms are surgical. The executioner targets the biceps and the triceps. He slices the muscle away from the humerus bone. He does not hack, he peels. The visual is horrifying. The arm remains attached. The hand is still tied to the post. The fingers may still be twitching, but the shape of the arm is gone. It has been reduced to a stick of bone wrapped in tendons. As the procedure continues, the prisoner often enters a state of dissociation. Medical experts and historians debate the level of pain felt during the later stages. The initial cuts are undoubtedly excruciating, a fire washing over the nervous system. But as trauma mounts, the body dumps endorphins. The brain, unable to process the magnitude of the injury, may shut down the pain receptors. The prisoner might stare blankly at the horizon, or look down at their own legs as if they belong to a stranger. This is the ecstatic trance that Western philosophers later obsessed over, the point where pain exceeds the capacity of the human mind and becomes something else entirely, a void of sensation. In the standard 8 cuts method, after the chest and the arms, the executioner moves to the legs. The flesh of the thighs is removed. This serves a practical purpose. It ensures the prisoner can never stand again, even in the afterlife. They are physically grounded, humbled before the emperor. By this point, the prisoner is usually silent. The screaming stops, not because the pain has ceased, but because the energy required to scream is gone. The blood loss is controlled, but cumulative. The face of the condemned turns the color of ash. The lips turn blue. They hang limply from the ropes, held up only by the bindings at the wrists and the queue. But the crowd is not just watching the knife. In the chaotic, desperate years of the late 19th century, a macabre superstition took hold among the uneducated peasantry. It was believed that the blood of an executed man, specifically one executed by the state, which imbued the act with cosmic power, could cure illnesses. It was a desperate remedy for desperate times. As the blood pooled at the base of the post, or dripped from the severed flesh, there were instances where spectators would rush forward with mantou. They would soak the white bread in the fresh red blood until it was sodden. These blood buns were then rushed home to be fed to relatives dying of consumption. It was a cannibalistic communion, a belief that the life force of the strong criminal could revitalize the weak. This practice creates a horrifying tableau. While a man is being tortured to death for treason, the people he supposedly betrayed are treating his body as a pharmacy. It highlights the profound desperation and the distinct cultural logic of the era. The body was a resource. For the worst offenders, the 3 abominations, the punishment extended beyond the 8 cuts. In the 24 cuts or 36 cuts variations, the detail was finer. The executioner would target the elbows, the knees, the shoulders. He would remove the ears. The removal of the ears was particularly significant. In Chinese physiognomy, the ears represent the ability to hear wisdom and truth. To lose them was to be marked as one who refused to listen to the emperor's mandate. Then, the nose would be sliced off. The destruction of the face was the destruction of identity. A man without a face has no mianzi/reputation. He is an anonymous monster. There are dark legends, mostly from the Ming dynasty, of the 1,000 cuts being literal. The case of the corrupt eunuch Lu Jin is the most cited example. Records claim he was sentenced to 3,357 cuts. In such extreme outlier cases, the technique was different. It was described as fish scaling. The executioner would use a very small, very sharp blade to remove tiny slivers of skin and subcutaneous fat, size of a coin, without cutting into the muscle initially. This was designed to prolong the surface pain without causing fatal blood loss. It was an exercise in pure sadism. However, by the Qing era, specifically the period captured in photographs in 1904-1905, this fish scaling had largely vanished. The cuts were large, blocky, and brutal. The focus had shifted from the duration of pain to the visual impact of the destruction. Finally, the end must come. The coup de grace. The magistrate gives a signal. The executioner takes the heart-digging knife. He steps up to the exposed chest. With a forceful thrust, he drives the blade between the ribs, piercing the heart. The prisoner's body spasms once, a final, violent convulsion, and then goes still. The spirit has been evicted. But the ritual is not over. The final act is the beheading. The heavy blade descends, severing the neck. The head rolls. It is picked up by the queue and displayed to the magistrate, and then to the crowd. The basket of flesh and the severed limbs are collected. In some cases, the family is permitted to collect the remains to try and stitch them back together for burial, a desperate attempt to fool the gods of the underworld and grant their relative a whole body. But often, the remains were left for the wild dogs, or thrown into the baby tower pits where the unwanted dead were discarded. As the sun begins to dip past noon, the crowd disperses. The show is over. They return to their tea, their farms, their trade. The executioner cleans his blade on a cloth, packing his tools away. The ground at Kaishiku is dark with blood, but by tomorrow morning, fresh dust will have covered it. The vegetable sellers will set up their stalls on the very spot where a man was unmade. To truly grasp the weight of Lingchi, we must step away from the anonymous blood of the common criminal and look into the eyes of those whose names were carved into history by the knife. The punishment was not always just. In the twilight of the Ming dynasty, it became a weapon of political paranoia, and its most tragic victim was General Yuan Chongwan. Yuan was a brilliant strategist, a patriot who stood as the last iron wall defending the Chinese Empire against the invading Manchu armies from the north. He was the shield of the Ming. But the emperor he served, the Chongshen Emperor, was a man consumed by suspicion. Through a clever counterintelligence plot by the enemy, the emperor was convinced that his most loyal general was actually a traitor conspiring with the invaders. In 1630, Yuan was summoned to Beijing not for a reward, but for a trial. The sentence was Lingchi. What makes Yuan's execution unique, and uniquely horrifying, was the reaction of the citizens of Beijing. These were the very people Yuan had fought to protect. Yet, believing the lies that he had sold them out to the barbarians, their fear turned into a rabid hatred. Historical accounts suggest that on the day of his execution, the crowd was not merely watching, they were hungry for vengeance. As the executioner sliced the flesh from Yuan's body, the spectators reportedly bought the pieces of meat for copper coins and ate them raw, washing them down with wine. They cursed his name with every bite. Yuan Chongwan, the hero of the nation, died hearing the sound of his own people devouring him. He reportedly screamed for half a day before silence finally claimed him. It was a moment where the slow slicing revealed the darkest capacity of human mob psychology. It would take nearly 150 years for his name to be cleared, and for history to recognize him as a hero. But by then, his ghost had long been wandering the void, a victim of the ultimate betrayal. If Yuan's death illustrated the tragedy of Lingchi, the death of the eunuch Lu Jin illustrated its excess. A century earlier, Lu Jin had become one of the most powerful and corrupt men in China, effectively hijacking the government. When his crimes were exposed, hoarding millions of taels of gold and plotting assassination, the Zhongde emperor ordered a punishment that would echo through eternity. He sentenced Lu Jin to be cut 3,357 times over a period of 3 days. This is the origin of the Thousand Cuts legend. On the first day, the executioners were surgical, inflicting several hundred shallow cuts, carefully avoiding major arteries to keep the heart beating. Lu Jin was dragged back to his cell at night, terrified and still alive. He was fed rice porridge to sustain his strength for more torture. He died on the second day, unable to endure the trauma. The remaining cuts were performed on his corpse. This spectacle was the state saying that for the crime of supreme corruption, death was not an event, but a process. But as the centuries turned, the world began to shrink. By the late 19th century, the isolated Middle Kingdom was forced open by the gunboats of the West. Britain, France, and Germany carved out spheres of influence in China. With the soldiers and diplomats came a new invention, a device that would change how the world understood torture: the camera. Before photography, Lingchi was just a rumor in the West, a tall tale told by sailors. But in 1904 and 1905, as the Qing dynasty gasped its last breaths, French soldiers stationed in Beijing attended executions at Keishiku. They brought their tripod cameras. They captured the death of a man named Fu Zhuli, a Mongol guard convicted of murdering a prince. These images are haunting. They are grainy black and white windows into a nightmare. They show Fu Zhuli bound to the stake, his chest exposed, the executioner leaning in with a focused, almost bored expression. They show the crowd, impassive, watching the scene. These photographs traveled. They were printed as postcards, macabre souvenirs sent from Beijing to Paris and London. They appeared in newspapers. They did more damage to China's reputation than any war. To the Western eye, these images were proof of Oriental despotism. They were used as propaganda to justify colonialism. Western leaders argued that a civilization that practiced such savage justice was unfit to rule itself. The philosopher Georges Bataille later meditated on these photos. He described an expression not of pain, but of a disturbing religious ecstasy. Historians now believe the ecstasy was simply the blank stare of a man heavily drugged with opium. The pressure was mounting. It was not just the shame of the Western gaze, but the internal realization among Chinese intellectuals that the old ways were dooming the nation. A new generation of legal scholars, led by the reformer Shen Jiabin, began to rewrite the penal code. He argued that the severity of punishment did not deter crime. He pointed out that Western nations had abolished torture and yet maintained order. He argued that Lingchi was a stain on the dignity of the empire. The arguments were fierce, but the tide of history was irresistible. In April 1905, the memorial was presented to the Empress Dowager Cixi. With a stroke of her brush, she signed the decree. Lingchi was officially abolished. The slow slicing was erased from the law. The execution of Fu Zhuli was among the last. The dynasty itself would fall just 6 years later. Today, Lingchi lives on as a metaphor. But it was never just a metaphor. It was a system of absolute control, a collaboration between theology and law, a claim by the state over the human soul. The posts are gone, but the ghosts of Keishiku remain. A silent warning of what happens when power is allowed to slice too slowly.